Chapter 5. Prince into King. The Ascension of Jaehaerys 1. Jaehaerys I Targaryen ascended the Iron Throne in 48 AC at the age of 14 and would rule the Seven Kingdoms for the next 55 years, until his death of natural causes in 103 AC. In the later years of his reign, and during the reign of his successor, he was called the Old King, for obvious reasons, but Jaehaerys was a young and vigorous man for far longer than he was an aged and feeble one, and more thoughtful scholars speak of him reverently as the Conciliator. Archmaester Umbert, writing a century later, famously declared that Aegon the Dragon and his sisters conquered the Seven Kingdoms, 6 of them, at least, but it was Jaehaerys the Conciliator who truly made them one. His was no easy task, for his immediate predecessors had undone much of what the conqueror had built, Aenys through weakness and indecision, Maegor with his bloodlust and cruelty. The realm that Jaehaerys inherited was impoverished, war-torn, lawless, and riven with division and mistrust, whilst the new king himself was a green boy with no experience of rule. Even his claim to the Iron Throne was not wholly beyond question. Although Jaehaerys was the only surviving son of King Aenys I, his older brother Aegon had claimed the kingship before him. Aegon the Uncrowned had died at the battle beneath the God's Eye whilst trying to unseat his uncle Maegor, but not before taking to wife his sister Rhaena and siring 2 daughters, the twins Arya and Rhaella. If Maegor the Cruel were accounted only a usurper with no right to rule, as certain maesters argued, then Prince Aegon had been the true king, and the succession by rights should pass to his elder daughter, Arya, not his younger brother. The sex of the twins weighed against them, however, as did their age. The girls were but 6 at Maegor's death. Furthermore, accounts left us by contemporaries suggest that Princess Arya was a timid child when young, much given to tears and bedwetting, whilst Rhaella, the bolder and more robust of the pair, was a novice serving at the Starry Sept and promised to the faith. Neither seemed to have the makings of a queen. Their own mother, Queen Rhaena, conceded as much when she agreed that the crown should go to her brother Jaehaerys rather than her daughters. Some suggested that Rhaena herself might have the strongest claim to the crown, as the firstborn child of King Aenys and Queen Alyssa. There were even some who whispered that it was Queen Rhaena who had somehow contrived to free the realm from Maegor the Cruel, though by what means she might have arranged his death after fleeing King's Landing on her dragon, Dreamfire, has never been successfully established. Her sex told against her, however. This is not Dorne, Lord Rhaegar Baratheon said when the notion was put to him, and Rhaena is not Nymeria. Moreover, the twice-widowed queen had come to loathe King's Landing and the court, and wished only to return to Fair Isle, where she had found a measure of peace before her uncle had made her one of his black brides. Prince Jaehaerys was still a year and a half shy of manhood when he first ascended the Iron Throne. Thus it was determined that his mother, the Dowager Queen Alyssa, would act as regent for him, whilst Lord Rhaegar served as his hand and the protector of the realm. Let it not be thought, however, that Jaehaerys was merely a figurehead. Right from the first, the boy king insisted upon having a voice in all decisions made in his name. Even as the mortal remains of Maegor I Targaryen were consigned to a funeral pyre, his young successor faced his first crucial decision: how to deal with his uncle's remaining supporters. By the time Maegor was found dead upon the Iron Throne, most of the great houses of the realm and many lesser lords had abandoned him. But most is not all. Many of those whose lands and castles were near King's Landing and the Crownlands had stood with Maegor until the very hour of his death, amongst them the lords Rosby and Towers, the last men to see the king alive. Others who had rallied to his banners included the lords Stokeworth, Massey, Hart, Bywater, Darkland, Rollingford, Mallory, Bar Emmon, Birch, Staunton, and Buckwell. In the chaos that had followed the discovery of Maegor's body, Lord Rosby drank a cup of hemlock to join his king in death. Buckwell and Rollingford took ship for Pentos, whilst most of the others fled to their own castles and strongholds. Only Darkland and Staunton had the courage to remain with Lord Towers to yield up the Red Keep when Prince Jaehaerys and his sisters, Rhaena and Alysanne, descended upon the castle on their dragons. The court chronicles tell us that as the young prince slid from the back of Vermithor, these 3 leal lords bent their knees before him to lay their swords at his feet, hailing him as king. "You come late to the feast," Prince Jaehaerys reportedly told them, though in a mild tone, "and these same blades helped slay my brother Aegon beneath the God's Eye." At his command, the 3 were immediately put in chains, though some of the prince's party called for them to be executed on the spot. In the black cells they were soon joined by the king's justice, the Lord Confessor, the chief jailer, the commander of the city watch, and the 4 knights of the Kingsguard who had remained beside King Maegor. A fortnight later, Lord Rhogar Baratheon and Queen Alyssa arrived at King's Landing with their host, and hundreds more were seized and imprisoned. Be they knights, squires, stewards, septons, or serving men, the charge against them was the same. They were accused of having aided and abetted Maegor Targaryen in usurping the Iron Throne and in all the crimes, cruelties, and misrule that followed. Not even women were exempt. Those ladies of noble birth who had attended the Black Brides were arrested as well, together with a score of lowborn trolls named as Maegor's whores. With the dungeons of the Red Keep full to bursting, the question arose as to what should be done with the prisoners. If Maegor were to be counted as usurper, then his entire reign was unlawful and those who had supported him were guilty of treason and must needs be put to death. Such was the course urged by Queen Alyssa. The Dowager Queen had lost 2 sons to Maegor's cruelty and was of no mind to grant the men who had carried out his edicts even the dignity of a trial. When my boy Jaehaerys was tortured and slain, these men stood by silently and spoke no word of protest, she said. Why should we listen to them now? Against her fury stood Lord Rhogar Baratheon, hand of the king and protector of the realm. Whilst his lordship agreed that Maegor's men were surely deserving of punishment, he pointed out that should their captives be executed, the usurper's remaining loyalists would be disinclined to bend the knee. Lord Rhogar would have no choice but to march on their castles one by one and winkle each man out of his stronghold with steel and fire. It can be done, but at what cost? He asked. It would be a bloody business, one that might harden hearts against us. Let Maegor's men stand trial and confess their treason, the protector urged. Those found guilty of the worst crimes could be put to death. For the remainder, let them tender hostages to ensure their future loyalty, and surrender some of their lands and castles. The wisdom of Lord Rhogar's approach was plain to most of the young king's other supporters, yet his views might not have prevailed had not Jaehaerys himself taken a hand. Though only 10 and 4, the boy king proved from the first that he would not be content to sit by meekly whilst others ruled in his name. With his maester, his sister Alysanne, and a handful of young knights by his side, Jaehaerys climbed the Iron Throne and summoned his lords to attend him. There will be no trials, no torture, and no executions, he announced to them. The realm must see that I am not my uncle. I shall not begin my reign by bathing in blood. Some came to my banners early, some late. Let the rest come now. Jaehaerys as yet had neither been crowned nor anointed, and was still shy of his majority. His pronouncement therefore had no legal force, nor did he have the authority to overrule his council and regent. Yet such was the power of his words, and the determination he displayed as he sat looking down upon them all from the Iron Throne, that Lords Baratheon and Balerion at once gave the prince their support, and the rest soon followed. Only his sister Rhaena dared say him nay. They will cheer you as the crown is placed upon your head, she said, as once they cheered our uncle, and before him our father. In the end, the question rested with the regent. And whilst Queen Alyssa desired vengeance for her own sake, she was loath to go against her son's wishes. It would make him seem weak, she is reported to have said to Lord Rhogar, and he must never seem weak. That was his father's downfall. And thus it was that most of Maegor's men were spared. In the days that followed, the dungeons of King's Landing were emptied. After being given food and drink and clean raiment, the captives were escorted to the throne room 7 at a time. There, before the eyes of gods and men, they renounced their allegiance to Maegor and did homage to his nephew Jaehaerys from their knees, whereupon the young king bade each man rise, granted him pardon, and restored his lands and titles. It must not be thought that the accused escaped without punishment, however. Lords and knights alike were compelled to send a son to court to serve the king and stand as hostages. From those who had no sons, a daughter was required. The wealthiest of Maegor's lords surrendered certain lands as well, Towers, Darkland, and Staunton amongst them. Others purchased their pardons with gold. The royal clemency did not extend to all. Maegor's headsmen, jailers, and confessors were all adjudged to be guilty of abetting Tyanna of the Tower in the torture and death of Prince Jaehaerys, who had so briefly been Maegor's heir and hostage. Their heads were delivered to Queen Alyssa, together with the hands they had dared raise against the blood of the dragon. Her Grace pronounced herself well pleased with the tokens. One other man also lost his head, Sir Moladon Moore, a Kingsguard knight, who was accused of having held Cerys Hightower, Maegor's first queen, whilst his sworn brother, Sir Owen Bush, removed her tongue, during which her grace's struggles caused the blade to slip, bringing about her death. Sir Maladon, it should be noted, insisted the whole tale was a fabrication, and said Queen Cerys died of shrewishness. He did, however, admit to delivering Tiana of the Tower to King Maegor's hands and standing witness as he slew her, so he had a queen's blood on his hands regardless. 5 of Maegor's 7 yet survived. 2 of those, Sir Oliver Bracken and Sir Raymond Mallory, had played a part in the late king's fall by turning their cloaks and going over to Jaehaerys, but the boy king observed rightly that in doing so they had broken their vows to defend the king's life with their own. I will have no oathbreakers at my court, he proclaimed. All 5 Kingsguard were therefore sentenced to death. But at the urging of Princess Alysanne, it was agreed that they might be spared if they would exchange their white cloaks for black by joining the Night's Watch. 4 of the 5 accepted this clemency and departed for the Wall, along with Sir Oliver and Sir Raymond. The turncloaks went Sir John Tollet and Sir Simon Crane. The 5th Kingsguard, Sir Harold Langward, demanded a trial by battle. Jaehaerys granted his wish and offered to face Sir Harold himself in single combat, but in this he was overruled by the Queen Regent. Instead, a young knight from the Stormlands was sent forth as the crown's champion. Sir Giles Morrigan, the man chosen, was a nephew to Daemon the Devout, the Grand Captain of the Warriors' Sons, who had led them in their trial of 7 against Maegor. Eager to prove his house's loyalty to the new king, Sir Giles made short work of the elderly Sir Harold, and was named Lord Commander of Jaehaerys' Kingsguard soon after. Meanwhile, word of the prince's clemency spread throughout the realm. One by one, the remainder of King Maegor's adherents dismissed their hosts, left their castles, and made the journey to King's Landing to swear fealty. Some did so reluctantly, fearing that Jaehaerys might prove to be as weak and feckless a king as his father, but as Maegor had left no heirs of the body, there was no plausible rival around whom opposition might gather. Even the most fervent of Maegor's supporters were won over once they met Jaehaerys, for he was all a prince should be, fair-spoken, open-handed, and as chivalrous as he was courageous. Grand Maester Benefort, newly returned from his self-imposed exile in Pentos, wrote that he was learned as a maester and pious as a septon, and whilst some of that may be discounted as flattery, there was truth to it as well. Even his mother, Queen Alyssa, is reported to have called Jaehaerys the best of my 3 sons. It must not be thought that the reconciliation of the lords brought peace to Westeros overnight. King Maegor's efforts to exterminate the poor fellows and the warriors' sons had set many pious men and women against him, and against House Targaryen. Whilst he had collected the heads of hundreds of stars and swords, hundreds more remained at large, and tens of thousands of lesser lords, landed knights, and small folk sheltered them, fed them, and gave them aid and comfort wherever they could. Ragged Silas and Dennis the Lame commanded roving bands of poor fellows who came and went like wraiths, vanishing into the greenwood whenever threatened. North of the Golden Tooth, the Red Dog of the Hills, Sir Joffrey Doggett, moved between the Westerlands and Riverlands at will, with the support and connivance of Lady Lucinda, the pious wife of the Lord of Riverrun. Sir Joffrey, who had taken upon himself the mantle of the Grand Captain of the Warriors' Sons, had announced his intention to restore that once proud order to its former glory, and was recruiting knights to its banners. Threat was in the south, where Septon Moon and his yet the greatest followers camped beneath the walls of Aldtown, defended by Lord Oakhart and Lord Rowan and their knights. A massive hulk of a man, Moon had been blessed with a thunderous voice and an imposing physical presence. Though his poor fellows had proclaimed him the true High Septon, this Septon, if indeed he was such, was no picture of piety. He boasted proudly that the 7-pointed star was the only book he had ever read, and many questioned even that, for he had never been known to quote from that holy tome, and no man had ever seen him read nor write. Barefoot, bearded, and possessed of immense fervor, the poorest fellow could speak for hours, and often did. And what he spoke about was sin. I am a sinner, were the words with which Septon Moon began every sermon, and so he was. A creature of immense appetites, a glutton and a drunkard renowned for his lechery, Moon lay each night with a different woman, impregnating so many of them that his acolytes began to say that his seed could make a barren woman fertile. Such was the ignorance and folly of his followers that this tale became widely believed. Husbands began to offer him their wives and mothers their daughters. Septon Moon never refused such offers, and after a time some of the hedge knights and men at arms amongst his rabble began to paint images of the cock o' the moon on their shields, and a brisk trade grew up in clubs, pendants, and staffs carved to resemble Moon's member. A touch with the head of these talismans was believed to bestow prosperity and good fortune. Every day Septon Moon went forth to denounce the sins of House Targaryen and the lickspittle who permitted their abominations, whilst inside Aldtown the true father of the faithful had become a virtual prisoner in his own palace, unable to set forth outside the confines of the Starry Sept. Though Lord Hightower had closed his gates against Septon Moon and his followers and refused to allow them entrance to his city, he showed no eagerness to take up arms against them, despite repeated entreaties from His High Holiness. When pressed for reasons, his lordship cited a distaste for shedding pious blood, but many claimed the real reason was his unwillingness to offer battle to Lords Oakhart and Rowan, who had granted Moon their protection. His reluctance earned him the name Lord Donald the Delayer from the maesters of the Citadel. The long conflict between King Maegor and the Faith had made it imperative that Jaehaerys be anointed king by the High Septon. Lord Rogar and the Queen Regent agreed. Before that could happen, however, Septon Moon and his ragged horde must needs be dealt with, so the prince could travel safely to Aldtown. It had been hoped that the news of Maegor's death would be sufficient to persuade Moon's followers to disperse, and some had done just that. But no more than a few hundred in a host that numbered close to 5,000. What can the death of one dragon matter when another rises up to take its place? Septon Moon declared to his throng. Westeros will not be clean again until all the Targaryens have been slain or driven back into the sea. Every day he preached anew, calling upon Lord Hightower to deliver Aldtown to him, calling upon the High Lickspittle to leave the Starry Sept and face the wrath of the poor fellows he had betrayed, calling upon the small folk of the realm to rise up. And every night he sinned anew. Across the realm in King's Landing, Jaehaerys and his counselors considered how to rid the realm of this scourge. The boy king and his sisters, Rhaena and Alysanne, all had dragons, and some felt the best way to deal with Septon Moon was the way Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters had dealt with the two kings on the field of fire. Jaehaerys had no taste for such slaughter, however, and his mother, Queen Alyssa, flatly forbade it, reminding them of the fate of Rhaenys Targaryen and her dragon in Dorne. Lord Rogar, the king's hand, said, with some reluctance, that he would lead his own host across the reach and disperse Moon's men by force of arms, though it would mean pitting his Stormlanders, and whatever other forces he might gather, against Lords Rowan and Oakhart and their knights and men at arms, as well as the poor fellows. Like as not, we will win, the Protector said, but not without cost. Mayhaps the gods were listening, for even as the king and council argued in King's Landing the problem was resolved in a most unexpected way. Dusk was falling outside of Aldtown when Septon Moon retired to his tent for his evening meal, exhausted by a day of preaching. As always he was guarded by his poor fellows, huge strapping axemen with unshorn beards, but when a comely young woman presented herself at the Septon's tent with a flagon of wine that she wished to give to His Holiness in return for his help, they admitted her at once. They knew what sort of help the woman required, the sort that would put a babe inside her belly. A short time passed, during which the men outside the tent heard only occasional gusts of laughter from Septon Moon, inside. But then, suddenly, there was a groan, and a woman's shriek, followed by a bellow of rage. The tent flap was thrown open and the woman burst out, half naked and barefoot, and dashed away wide-eyed and terrified before any of the poor fellows could think to stop her. Septon Moon himself followed a moment later, naked, roaring, and drenched in blood. He was holding his neck, and blood was leaking between his fingers and dripping down into his beard from where his throat had been slit open.